Hello, and welcome back to the Form Review. Today, we'll be looking at the 2021 film, Zack Snyder's Justice League. Now sit back, relax, grab your drinks, and let's talk about this movie.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Former Review. This is Season 4, Episode 1, and I thank you all for tuning in once again. Yes, welcome to a new season of the Former Review. Now, in the last episode, I talked about the best movies of 2020 movie season and my thoughts on the Oscar predictions. So, now that we've gone through that, we're now entering the next movie season, which starts off with a banger. Zack Snyder's Justice League. So stay tuned to hear that.
Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had a lot of questions. Like, how do I record an episode? How do I get my show into all the apps that people like to listen on? How do I make money from my podcast? The answer to every single one of those questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing my podcast. And best of all, it's absolutely 100% free and ridiculously easy to use. And now Anchor can match you with some great sponsors. That means you can get paid to podcast right away. In fact, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast and make money doing it, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. Again, that's anchor.fm/start. And I can't wait to hear your podcast.
So Zack Snyder's Justice League is often referred to also as the Snyder Cut, and it is the director's cut of the superhero film Justice League. It is technically the fifth film in the DC Extended Universe, and it is based on, obviously, the DC Comics superhero team of this same name. And this specifically is as director Snyder had intended it to be before he left production. Now, like the theatrical release that came out in 2017, it follows the Justice League made up of Batman, played by Ben Affleck, Superman, played by Henry Cavill, Wonder Woman, played by Gal Gadot, Cyborg, played by Ray Fisher, Aquaman, played by Jason Momoa, and The Flash, played by Ezra Miller, as they attempt to save the world. Now, to fully talk about this movie in its full extent, I will have to do a spoiler section, and I'll do that at the end. Now, I'm going to first go into just my spoiler-free thoughts of it, so you kind of get where I'm going with things, and if you choose to listen on to the spoiler section, it will spoil the movie for you, and I'm going to be 100% honest about a lot of things, including my issues with it. So proceed into that section with caution. I will say at that point when I'm going to be talking about spoilers again. But my spoiler-free thoughts are, what Snyder built with his director's cut is honestly a much better movie than the theatrical cut. The team-up aspect is much more coherent, the backstories of Flash and Cyborg are much more fleshed out, and even the more CGI-heavy villain Steppenwolf has more to do in this movie and has a slightly more developed backstory. The action scenes are fairly fantastic, and Zack Snyder does create a fairly thrilling movie that was exciting to watch on each of the 5 times that I've seen it, even though it is extremely CGI heavy. And frankly, this movie screams Zack Snyder. So if you weren't really a fan of anything that he's done in the past, you're not gonna like him here. That's pretty much it, because everything about this movie is Zack Snyder, for better or worse. And while this new cut of the film is 100% an upgrade over the theatrical version, that's honestly not a hard of a task to accomplish. Outside of the extended length of the movie, the story going from A to Z is fairly identical to the theatrical version of the movie. And this film also falls into something that Snyder has really struggled with both of his previous DCEU outings, Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. Because even with its 4-hour runtime, it still has a fairly rushed story and some unclear motivations. While Cyborg and the Flash's stories are fleshed out more, Furthermore, a lot of other minor DC characters have little to no reason for being in the film aside from being fan lore. And depending on how the audience's view of how well Snyder approached the main characters of the past films will also bring in some questionable decisions by them. Furthermore, albeit a stylistic choice, the vision of the film into its chapters does very little to establish his themes for the entire movie, and also each chapter, aside from being a clever wordplay based on what happens in the chapter, it doesn't really progress the movie in any way that really emphasizes a reason for that to be done. If you look at other longer movies that either have one intermission in the middle of it, that's because that was the style going on back then. And similarly, even with the Lord of the Rings movies, which are arguably just as long as this, and same with the Hobbit movies, there's not so much a breaks on those either. So this was more of a stylistic choice that doesn't really add much to the overall story. And overall, this film does have a lot of things to like, but also a lot of things that are problematic. And again, for fans of Snyder's work, there's a lot here to love, and really honestly to demand from Warner Brothers to make more of. For those who aren't fans of him, this film barely breaks the mold of a good superhero movie. And frankly, it is a little bit different, so that shouldn't be too big of a deal. No matter what though, you can't deny that Snyder is undeniably gifted as putting out something that is extremely stylistic, and everything in this movie and also his other movies that is done on a grand scale is done fantastically, and this is the epitome of grand scale of movies. Now, though not nearly as good, there's a reason why that I brought up Lord of the Rings, because there's a lot of significant vibes that this movie gives up. Lord of the Rings is definitely on another level than this movie, but this movie definitely has a lot of similar attributes, for better or worse as well. Now, this film is a demonstration of both Snyder's strengths and weaknesses, and it's a lot of fun to watch, and honestly watch again. And I suggest that you all go watch the movie because it takes up a lot of time, but it is a fun time to watch, especially if you enjoy some of the superheroes. Okay, so the next little bit is going to be my spoiler heavy section, so proceed with caution. Okay, so again, what Snyder built is a much better movie than the theatrical cut, but that is not a hard thing to do. Now, what is perhaps one of the biggest things about this movie is how it actually came to be. It's one of the biggest pop culture things to happen in the past 3-4 years, especially through the course of the pandemic. And frankly, that is an accomplishment no matter what your thoughts are on the movie and Snyder himself, or your opinion of how Warner Brothers has dealt with this entire scenario. Now, I'm not going to talk about the entire scenario here, but in short, what happened obviously is that unfortunately during the production of the original Justice League, there was a tragedy in Zack Snyder's family and he had to leave. Now, this was arguably used as a reason to unofficially be fired from the project, and Warner Brothers was trying to force him out, which then led to the atrocity that came from that because they were trying to keep up with the MCU. And if you haven't heard me talk about that, obviously that's one of the biggest problems with Warner Brothers in general, is them trying to essentially copy what the MCU did, which honestly is an unattainable task, but they apparently think that's the best way to go, so we'll let that be. But since then, there was a huge demand because of how cheesy the theatrical cut was compared to how dark and intense that Snyder had done in his prior two movies. There obviously was this big movement, and then toward the beginning of 2020, they announced that he was going to be working on that pretty much the entire year of 2020, and then releasing a new director's cut of the movie, which is what we got in this 4-hour movie, which is a quite significant longer story than what we got in the theatrical cut. The biggest, honestly, improvement is that it removes, again, almost everything that was believed to be Whedon. Though there were some scenes that I thought were Whedon, but were actually Snyder. First real shock for me that I thought was a Justice League version was when the team is meeting up with Commissioner Gordon on the roof, and then
Do you really think that...
Oh, wow, they really just vanish. Huh? Oh, that's rude.
That scene was very much Joss Whedon to me. And it's a weird feeling to know that that scene wasn't his. And that was one of Zack Snyder's choices. Because that scene makes no sense when you think about it logically. Yes, suspend your disbelief and whatnot, but one person darting away really quickly and the person who they with didn't notice because their back was turned, that's one thing. But one of the persons that's the fastest of them and standing right next to them doesn't notice it, doesn't make any logical sense. Again, I know it's a comment on that type of thing that happens in superhero movies, especially Batman movies, but no, I don't like that scene at all. Anyway, before I get into my issues with this movie, I want to list off some really specific things that I loved or I really liked about this movie. Now, I really enjoyed the small moments with some of the heroes, especially Wonder Woman and Aquaman. And they didn't need a lot of additional material, but Snyder did add little things here and there that I think worked really well. There was a really interesting little bit in the middle of the movie where they're digging up Superman's body, and there's this exchange of words between Aquaman and Wonder Woman showing
An Amazon working with an Atlantean. How many thousands of years since our people spoke?
I don't know. I'm not exactly close to mine. I hate Atlanteans as much as you Amazons do.
Hate is useless.
that there was this conflict between Atlanteans and the Themyscirans, which I thought was really interesting given what happens in the Flashpoint storyline. The Atlanteans go to war with the Themyscirans. So I thought that that was a really cool little add in there. But my personal favorite scene in the entire movie had no action, no drama. It was a scene with Diana and Alfred, played by Jeremy Irons, who honestly is one of the better casts in this movie. Not to say anyone else is bad, but he is an unspoken hero of this. And I think some of his additional scenes were extremely welcomed. But this scene specifically...
Oh, Miss Prince, let me do that.
No, that's okay. I can do it myself. Would you like to have some?
No, thank you. If you put the water in first.
Of course.
So we don't scald the tea. Yes.
Great.
No, that's probably enough tea.
All right. You sure you don't want to have some?
I won't, thank you. And then leave it to mash.
I will. I will. Definitely will.
Felt really organic to their characters. Wonder Woman doesn't need Alfred to make her tea, but will still offer to make him tea, and then he can't help himself to try to make the tea because that's something that he's been doing for such a long time for Bruce. And it's such this little scene that does a lot and frankly shows that Snyder does care about these characters. I also think the score is utterly fantastic, and I personally absolutely love the new tribal sound that they added for Wonder Woman's theme. I didn't think I needed a new turn on the Wonder Woman theme because obviously that theme is really good by itself, but it was a welcome addition.
So like I said already, the plot itself plays out very similar to the theatrical storyline, but there are many new elements, subplots, and teasers for the sequel stories that Zack Snyder was anticipating on doing, as well as potential future solo movies and also teasers for those characters. And then the epilogue itself is almost like a sequel short film, but it's just attached at the end of the first movie, and there's almost enough new cyborg footage that I'll go to in a little bit that could make a whole movie, and it completely changes his character. And I think the way that they use Wonder Woman as well throughout the movie was simply better than the theatrical cut. This is slightly different than what we saw in Wonder Woman and Wonder Woman 1984, and I understand why people don't like that version so much and prefer this somewhat tribal warrior woman type. However, superheroes have multiple sides of their personality. They aren't only one thing and that's it. In Wonder Woman 1984, you see a more humanized version of this character than in this film, and then also Batman vs. Superman. However, to those out there asking why didn't she use the sword and shield like she did in here and in BVS, and also at some points in the first Wonder Woman movie, my response to you all is this: she is naive in the first film, and in her battles in BVS and Justice League are versus a lot more intense beings than two essentially humans in Wonder Woman 1984. She's smart enough to know that the sword and shield may not be needed to fight people after living in the world for 60 plus years. Anyway, one different scene for her is her first one that really has less butt shots that overly sexualize her attractiveness, and she honestly kills all of these attackers very, very violently.
violently, and you can even see the blood spatters on the wall when she bashes them against it. And this is one of the few times that you really notice that this movie is rated R. Honestly, other than a slightly more violent movie, Snyder only adds 3 F-bombs that may or may not have been needed. Otherwise, the movie doesn't feel rated R. But that scene with Alfred and her interaction with Aquaman were 2 of my favorite scenes in the movie. And Aquaman's character was also slightly different, and not a lot, but because we still know that he's this brusque and grumpy person, but we get more evidence that he's a good person inside. In the opening scene, there's a lot of these new side characters in this Nordic fishing village that we meet, and we get more of a subplot about Aquaman visiting all the villages all over the north to set him up better as being a good person, and then obviously eventually set it up the Aquaman solo movie. And at one point, they even have him looking at this statue of King Atlan and meeting with Volko, played by Willem Dafoe, who was completely cut out of the theatrical version. And Volko's speech in this scene is essentially there to set up the events of the Aquaman solo movie, though there's a slight inconsistency with his hair length, but that's nitpicking. Additionally, Snyder does foreshadow Aquaman having a different trident than his mother's in Cyborg's vision of the future, and if you look closely, the trident has 3 prongs where his mother has 5. Some say that he got this from the statue and not the events of the solo film. Arguably, though, that this could simply just be a statue and that's it. The trident isn't the real one, so he must get it from somewhere because he's also wearing the crown, so he eventually does progress to become the one and future king of Atlantis. See what I did there? Anyway, the point is that the new cut shows Arthur being a better person and not just a jokester. And he even cares for Cyborg, and so does the audience. This is because we get a completely new view of who he is. And there's enough footage here to even make a solo movie for this character, because in the new cut, he ends up being the heart of the movie, whereas in the theatrical, he's just more of a side character. And we see him playing football and then flashing back to where we meet his mother.
Mrs. Stone?
Dr. Stone.
We then see them get in a car accident, and then his father vows to save his life at any cost. Then later in the movie, we see him use the mother box to turn him into Cyborg. Then Snyder provides the audience with how Cyborg is connected to almost every machine on planet Earth. And through this, he is able to explain Cyborg's abilities in a very specific way. Cyborg is able to use his skills to even grant this amount of money to this woman via moving money into her bank account. And then throughout the film, there are a couple more scenes where he even discusses talking to machines.
He wants to fly. You talk to machines?
I speak to intelligence. This one's saying she can't fly because of a software issue, but I could fix it with a little time.
And this is something that was completely cut from the theatrical version. And then for the Flash character, we get this totally new scene with his introduction. And we even get a new version of his scene meeting his father at Ironhide's prison, where he references his mother's death and also his father being framed for it all, which obviously sets up the Flashpoint reverse story that they're most likely going to go into a little bit more in the Flash solo film. And I don't know if they plan on doing a big screen version of the Reverse Flash, because the story that they've kind of portrayed so far, it's going to be doing something very different from the comic book Flashpoint story, which I'm a little saddened about. But additionally, we even see slightly different powers that the Flash has.
It's like this layer of dimensional reality, and it seems to manipulate space-time. I call it the Speed Force.
Because at the end of the movie, when the mother boxes are able to unify, the planet starts to change, but the Flash ends up entering the Speed Force. We then see him running faster than he ever has before in time to rewind it, and we see everybody's body parts flying back onto their bodies. And in this moment, he even touches with his father, which I think is a really cool aspect that they added to it that they didn't have before. And they even foreshadow this with him messing with time when they bring Superman back to life, as he does miss the window that he's supposed to get, and you see the mother box slightly rewind a little bit. Now, speaking of Superman, I
also like some of the additions that they made to his story. We see that Lois Lane, played by Amy Adams, is most likely pregnant with Superman's child. Now, Snyder has said that storyline was supposed to play this big role in the sequel. Supposedly, she would eventually have a relationship with Batman, but then Darkseid would kill her, and then the baby, which then would break Superman's heart, and then this would make him vulnerable to the anti-life equation, and then make him go rogue like we see in the epilogue ending scene. So then the Flash travels back in time and correctly warns Batman to save Lois. They fix the timeline, defeat Darkseid, and then Batman eventually goes to sacrifice himself. Then, when Superman and Lois's baby was born, they would name him Bruce in honor of Bruce Wayne, and then but the child wouldn't have any of Superman's abilities. He would just be a normal human. So then in 20 years, he would then become Batman in a sort of Batman Beyond Terry McGinnis scenario. And this stuff definitely extrapolates the Nightmare timeline probabilities and also the idea of the multiverse, which Steppenwolf does bring up in the movie. And Steppenwolf looks very different, obviously. After watching the movie, I would say he definitely looks better, though I do still prefer the comic book look of him more, but that's just my personal opinion. And because of this redesign slash the way Snyder wanted it originally, it gives Steppenwolf a stronger background. And this and the added scenes make him more of a credible threat as we understand more of his backstory and his relationship with Darkseid. We find out in this movie that he was exiled from Apokolips because he was trying to usurp the throne from Darkseid, and then in the same scene you get that he is Darkseid family. In the comics, he's actually Darkseid's uncle, and his punishment for trying to usurp the throne is that he must go out and capture and convert many thousands of worlds before he's allowed to return to Apokolips. And this makes his entire motivation for the movie just wanting to go home. And then when he finds the anti-life equation, it changes everything. Basically, for those who don't know what this is the equation that Darkseid wants to use to conquer the entire multiverse. And this is where the DCEU is headed, even without Snyder. I do think that storyline is a bit of a crutch that comics books use a lot, but it does allow WB to keep the Snyder Cut in canon with all the new DC movies, and also all the old ones, and the TV shows. Then it also allows for the potential future to be the Nightmare and be in this universe as well. One that Joker, played by Jared Leto, and Bruce have this truce. And this is because Superman has gone rogue, and it's due to Batman's multiple attempts to fix the timeline. He then gives Batman a card to demonstrate the truce, but in Cyborg's vision of the future, you actually see that same card cut in half. And this means that in another alternate universe, a different timeline has happened, or Batman in some point in the future has called off their truce and probably wound up killing Joker, as he said he would eventually do. Now, I really love this scene with these two. I think it really brought in some new stuff that really, for me, redeemed Leto's version of Joker. Now, I wouldn't say it's the best Batman-Joker interaction, but it's still pretty good. I like that it finally got into which Robin suit was in Batman vs. Superman, and then that potentially could bring up a Red Hood, but who knows? There's a lot to like that I said, though that is because I know a lot of these things, and if you don't, that may take away from that for you.
So now going into the things that I have issues with this movie, and it's mostly due to the writing.
So to illustrate the biggest problem with the writing, I'm going to talk about 4 things. 1, the plot hole with Darkseid. 2, Martian Manhunter. 3, Superman's black suit. And 4, the ending. Now, with Darkseid's plot hole, the biggest issue with his motivation is that this guy is supposed to be one of the smartest people in the entire multiverse, but yet he forgets that the anti-life equation is on Earth. That is a big plot hole that they don't really explain. Why does he not know where it is? Somebody did ask Zack Snyder this, and his answer was, and I quote, "He almost died when he returned to Apokolips. He was in a fight for power, and much time passed before he was in a position of power again, and then all who had been with him had been slayed." Now, while that is a fine reason for it, that is Zack Snyder explaining that after the fact of the movie. Yes, that is something that could have happened, and it is very possible to happen. But that's the problem with the writing, because that should have been explained within the movie. Yes, again, it's 4 hours and maybe there wasn't enough time to do that, but that's one of the biggest problems with the writing here. Is if part of the story isn't within the story, then it is a plot hole. No matter how much you explain it afterwards, if the writing is there within the story itself, then it exists. Otherwise, I will believe Zack Snyder, but that is a problem that he doesn't explain in the movie. He explains it in an interview or whatever. And this goes into, again, the entire thing that he's had with Batman vs. Superman and Man of Steel. As he tries to do things either are very obviously done or they need external explanation for. While knowing those little things that make the movie a little bit better, a movie needs to be something that if you notice the details in something, you don't need somebody to connect the dots for you. Now, I'm not saying that somebody needs to be extremely obvious, because one of the biggest things with Man of Steel and also Batman vs. Superman is Snyder has been really on the nose with how much he wants Superman to be a Jesus-like character. Now, I'm not trying to go into religion here too much, but it's extremely on the nose that it's in multiple ways throughout one movie. He's 33. He floats away out of the ship in a crucifixion-like position. And then if you didn't get it, there's also a scene with him in front of a Christ-stained window. It's like, we get it, what you're trying to say here. So it's about finding that middle ground, and I think that's the one thing that Snyder has issues with, because he just can't seem to find that middle ground of needing to give an explanation via a watching with him or being very obvious about it. And a movie needs to have that middle ground. For example, with Tenet, you don't need to have Nolan's explanation to understand what is going on. Yes, it can be confusing on the first watch, but if you go back and look at the details yourself, you can notice it and you can see what the story is trying to do. So you don't need a director's commentary on a movie to understand the story or understand the significance of the story. Whereas with a lot of Snyder movies, especially with Batman vs. Superman and Man of Steel, you need those things. And that can add to the love of a movie for sure. And honestly, watching Batman vs. Superman now, knowing the details that Snyder had put into his film, makes me appreciate the movie more. The problem is that when I first watched the movie, there's still things that I had issues with. And I'm not the only one who had that. And people who love the movies now had those issues. So this shows that Snyder apparently needed to have a director's commentary on the story, and you shouldn't need that to make sure that people like your movie. That should be an additional piece of knowledge that, that's an Easter egg of some sort. I was alluding to it. And the thing is, Snyder does things in this way extremely well. Like, for example, and this is going into another problem that I had with this movie, is what I was talking about earlier with certain characters in this movie, and that really have no reason to be in this movie aside from just being fan lore, which includes Iris West, Commissioner Gordon, and honestly, Martian Manhunter. There really is no reason for these people to be into this movie aside from maybe setting up things, but that's really it. And I personally love seeing them in this movie. And yes, the people that were playing these characters were wonderfully cast. They just don't do anything more than really a glorified cameo. They don't really add anything to the plot, despite any pedigree that the actors playing them, and also their iconic placement in DC comic books. Lois Lane, played by Amy Adams, has even less to do here than she did in the prior DC films, which is saying a hell of a lot, because frankly, she didn't really do that much in the other movies, and frankly, her character just became more of an addition to this story. Now, again, I love seeing these things on screen. They were wonderful to see. Now, Martian Manhunter may have been somewhat in the last two Snyder films, but there was no reason for him to be in this one. And it really seems basically a retcon of the two movies. Now, we find out, obviously, in those rewatches with Snyder that Lennox playing the General is Martian Manhunter. He tells us this. There's really no indication when you go back and rewatch it, aside from little details that, again, are only details because Snyder has told us they're details, not because there's an actual reason for that in the story. But in this movie, why does he disguise himself as Ma Kent? There's no indication of
why. The reason that one could come up with is to convince her into keeping her spirits up, but then she does the same thing that she was doing the days before he came into her home. Yes, it may be the quote one last time, but there's no guarantee of that because it's not something we see. We assume that's what's going to happen. And then additionally, why is he introduced as Martian Manhunter?
And some have called me the Martian Manhunter.
Yes, that's his comic book name, but no one really goes around and says, "Hey, Martian Manhunter," or "How's your day going, Martian Manhunter?" They say his name that he's adapted, which is John Jones.
Supposedly, this scene was actually supposed to be for Green Lantern, but the studios weren't allowing him to do that, so that's why he did Martian Manhunter, but still, that doesn't really give him any explanation.
And this is maybe a small issue because people who don't really know who he is, and frankly, it's not a big deal, but it does mess up the character, and you compare it to how Snyder brings up Cyborg instead of Victor. They don't go around saying, "Hey, Cyborg, how's it going?" They don't say, "Hey, Batman." They say, "Hey, Bruce." And that's one of the things that I have with the Snyder Cut and also the theatrical cut is that how not Batman this movie is. But I'll get into that in a little bit. So, Martian Manhunter, though, it honestly felt that Snyder was shoehorning in a lot of fan love stuff that really doesn't make sense in the story. And that's just him saying, "Oh, this is Martian Manhunter." Okay, that doesn't hold up well for Bruce Wayne being a man or anyone else who is mankind. That I feel like that name needs to be addressed. And why is this character a thing? If you look at an example of how Snyder successfully brought in a new character was through his introduction of Ryan Choi, who is also known as the Justice Leaguer, the Atom. And for a lot of people who don't really know this character, he's along the similar lines of Ant-Man in the MCU. And this new character was brought up organically through a co-worker of Victor's father, Silas Stone. And it's a future leaguer that really I loved as getting a new character that we hadn't seen before, but it was brought up organically.
And this was totally cut out of the theatrical version, and Snyder revealed that he had been pitching this spin-off movie for the Atom to be set in China, and the studio turned him down even though he wanted to do this full-blown Atom movie originally, which I thought would have been really cool.
It wasn't brought up forcefully in a way that just felt unnatural. And this movie gives Ryan Choi a reason to be in the film and then uses him to set up a possibly unseen sequel. Now, Martian Manhunter was used to set up to be in this potential sequel, and I say potential because who knows what's going to happen at this point, and that's it. If it had only been the scene with Ma Kent, then it would have been slightly better, but still what problematic. Ending the note with the way they did just says, again, in case you didn't get it, this is a significant character that you need to know who he is for the next movie. Did we really need that? No. You didn't. It was already obvious enough by the first time that this was done. So this is again going into Snyder's problem, deciding whether to be really obvious about something, but trying to also be artistic and stylistic. And he's not able to accomplish that balance. Again, that's his trouble with his writing.
Now, the other problem, like I was saying, is with Superman's black suit. Now, this movie does include a totally new scene of Superman going back to the Kryptonian ship to get his black suit, which is a nice comic book cut for the return of Superman. And in the scene, we see a Kryptonian suit. There's also this traditional House of El armor, like what Jor-El was wearing during Man of Steel. And then there's one of Zod's armor, which is a little bit more intense. And then the blue suit. Then he chooses the black suit. Why? In the comics, it's sometimes called the recovery suit, after he was almost killed by Doomsday and Superman needed it to recover. As it said in the movie, who knows? In Man of Steel, he was wearing it during this nightmare vision that was created by General Zod, but not really a reason for it there either. So why is it here? I know that this was probably the intention to have it based on the source material, but there's no explanation of why he chooses it. He has the red and blue suit in front of him, but he goes for this one. Why? Yes, it's a cool Easter egg for fans, but is that it? There's no indication that I could see to why Snyder chooses this besides to be a fun thing for the fans. But again, why does he choose that suit? What is the significant difference between that suit and the red and blue suit? I know because I know the comics, but if you're a general fan or a general person, there's no reason for that.
And I say these reasons because Snyder has this issue of finding the middle ground between being extremely obvious and leaving things up for interpretation. Superman's black suit represents the interpretation without really any indication, and Martian Manhunter is the really obvious. Now, again, Ryan Choi, perfect way to do it. But he has to do everything, and that's the problem with a lot of his movies, is that he tries to put in so many different storylines into one movie. And this may be because of how the studios has not allowed a cohesive introduction of all these characters, similar to what the MCU did with introducing characters and then you bring them all together, whereas he had to bring in new characters because nobody else would. Maybe that's the reason why there's so much going on in these movies. And if that is it, okay, I can get that. I can get behind that. But unfortunately, that is a flaw with the movie. Is that Snyder's fault? No. But unfortunately, his movie suffers because of it. And frankly, the only movie that he honestly had to flesh out a one character by themselves is Man of Steel, and he even struggles with that. So again, Snyder just has issues with his writing. And I'm not, again, saying that everything that he does is horrific. In fact, honestly, Watchmen is one of his better movies, and similarly with 300. But that may be because he had a pretty good source material to base that off of. And technically, yes, Batman vs. Superman also dealt with the storyline of Death of Superman, but it's not a one-stop source material like 300 or Watchmen were. It's one graphic novel, let's make a movie from it. Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman, there's multiple comic books that he's taking inspiration from. And while I understand the reasons for some of that, and like some of those little bits here and there, that brings in a problematic story of having 4, 5, 6 different things going on at once that don't always work when you bring them together. Like with Batman vs. Superman, you have a Man of Steel sequel, a Batman introduction, a Justice League introduction, a Wonder Woman introduction, plus the Death of Superman storyline, while also setting up these other characters. And then this Justice League was supposed to introduce these characters, and you have to give them reason for everything, and it's a lot to swallow. And while, again, this goes down smoother than the other Justice League movie, it doesn't have everything that makes up an excellent movie. And again, this may be the culmination of what Snyder fans have really been aiming for this entire time. And yes, it is a great accomplishment.
I also really love how this movie is dedicated to his daughter, and you do get a lot of fatherhood aspects to his movies that really do play out well, especially with this tragedy that happened. And frankly, that may add to the longevity of this entire series. Who knows, though?
And yes, there's some really good things in this movie. But the last problem that I have with this movie is really the ending. Because Snyder just puts up more questions in this movie than really answers. While this really could have been answered in a sequel, because the epilogue takes us back to this post-apocalyptic landscape glimpse at a timeline in which Superman has gone rogue. Arguably what most likely happened is Lois was killed in some way and Superman sides with Darkseid. Batman has now teamed up with the Flash, who's wearing his Batman vs. Superman time travel armor. Mara, Deathstroke, who in the previous scene had signed up with Lex Luthor, and then Joker, and honestly is really cool. The interaction between them two is obviously a very well done. It does feel natural. But this entire sequence and scene really is only there to set up a sequel that we may or may not get. I personally, again, have a lot of issues with the Batman character in this movie because he doesn't seem to know a lot. And as the world's greatest detective, he needs to know more. And he needs to be able to do some stuff. Like, he just has almost everything explained to him. Yes, there's like teamwork and stuff like that, but why are those so significant? But then the moments where, oh, Bruce Wayne came up with the gauntlet idea is such a small moment that Alfred needs to say it. We don't see Batman doing these things. So pretty much any great detective work that I saw in Batman vs. Superman, which honestly in the live action movies is arguably the best detective work that we've seen, it's pretty much out the window. But at the end of the day, I guess that's just Snyder's version of the character, and I'll accept that, just like I'll accept Nolan's version of the Batman character. But still, I'm gonna say this: Mask of the Phantasm, still the best Batman movie out there. Overall, though, this movie was a hell of a lot of fun to watch and honestly watch again. It has a lot of things to like, but also a lot of things that are problematic. While this is definitely a huge improvement over the theatrical cut, it doesn't improve really Snyder's now consistent issues with storytelling, which again is fairly surprising since this film is 4 hours long. Like I said, for fans of Snyder's work, there's a lot to love in this movie. And then again, demand from Warner Brothers. For those who aren't fans of Snyder, this movie's not going to convince you to like him either. But
honestly, I've watched this movie now 5 times and I can't wait to watch it again. And then with watching this on a really big screen
was a lot of fun. Audio-wise, I would say this movie was a lot more fun than Wonder Woman 1984. Visually, not so much. I'm not a big fan of that aspect ratio. I get it is needed to get the IMAX view, but Nolan did IMAX multiple times and we get the entire screen, so not really sure how that is, but whatever. I will be buying this movie.
So obviously I really like this movie in spite of all of its problems.
So what did you all think? Let me know. Hit me up on social media.
The Formal Review is on Facebook, Twitter, and the Gram, and also YouTube. The handle's all the same. It's at The Formal Review. And for anyone who has supported me on a financial basis, I thank you very much for supporting me in that way. For anyone who wants to support, you can go to anchor.fm/the_formal_review and click support this podcast, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you all again for tuning in. And until next time, wash your hands, get vaccinated, and wear your mask.
And I'll see you at the movies.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Formal Review. Cheers, and we'll see you next time.